How does a predatory label boss permanently silence the foundational street prodigy who built his empire and dares to demand his stolen millions? The executives simply weaponize their capital, financially starving the rebellious legend while drowning his compliant younger brother in luxury to create the ultimate corporate attack dog. By the early 2000s, Birdman and Universal had placed an invisible economic blockade on BG, using Lil Wayne to publicly assassinate his mentor's credibility and monopolize the market. Stripped of his industry protection and cut off from his royalties, the desperate pioneer was pushed back into an illicit street survival that practically guaranteed his 14-year federal prison sentence, while the one who laid the foundation rots behind bars and his brainwashed younger brother is blinded by fame. The cold-hearted capitalists can simply sit back and count their money from the Civil War they orchestrated. In the early 1990s, New Orleans was far from the romanticized city of jazz and tourism sold in brochures. For the black working class, it operated as a strict containment zone. The city consistently hovered at the top of the national homicide statistics. Neighborhoods like the Magnolia Projects in the 3rd Ward and Holly Grove in the 17th Ward were geographic islands of profound economic neglect. The state had largely abandoned these areas, leaving behind a hyper-violent, illicit street economy. Rather than offering rehabilitation, the political infrastructure enforced militarized policing and mass incarceration. Survival in this ecosystem required a hardened exterior, hypervigilance, and a tribal reliance on your immediate circle. You did not expect to live past your 21st birthday, and you certainly did not survive alone. Christopher Dorsey, known to the streets as BG, Baby Gangsta, was a direct product of the Uptown Projects. His childhood was beyond difficult. It was violently abbreviated. When Christopher was just 12 years old, his father was murdered. In the psychology of the inner city, the sudden, violent loss of a father figure does not afford a child the luxury of grief. It thrusts them immediately into the role of survivalist. Unlike manufactured pop stars groomed for radio play, BG was a deeply traumatized child pouring his unprocessed grief, paranoia, and the grim reality of his block into a notebook. His lyrical delivery was heavy, authentic, and dripping with a pain that could not be faked. This raw, unfiltered documentation of street life caught the attention of two local brothers, Ronald Slim Williams and Brian Birdman Williams, who were running a fledgling independent operation called Cash Money Records. Signing with Cash Money as a young teenager in the mid-1990s, BG served as the absolute foundation of the roster. His early independent albums recorded when the label was operating out of the trunks of cars and local bounce clubs kept the lights on. He established the gritty, uncompromising sound that would define the company. He gave Cash Money its street credibility. In the eyes of the neighborhood, BG was Cash Money. A few miles away in the Holly Grove neighborhood, a different kind of survival story was unfolding. Dwayne Michael Carter Jr., soon to be known as Lil Wayne, was navigating his own fractured childhood. Unlike the hardened persona required to survive the Magnolia Projects, young Wayne was a straight A student. He possessed a razor-sharp, analytical mind and a frantic, undeniable charisma. But beneath the intelligence and the talent was a profound, aching vulnerability. Wayne's biological father had abandoned the family, leaving a void that young Dwayne desperately needed to fill. For a brief period, that void was filled by his beloved stepfather, Reginald Rabbit McDonald. Rabbit moved the family out of Hollygrove and provided a semblance of stability. But the gravity of the New Orleans streets is relentless. Before Wayne even reached adolescence, Rabbit was murdered. This second devastating abandonment left a permanent psychological void, one that a predatory executive was quietly waiting to exploit. Young Wayne was left reeling, searching desperately for an anchor, for validation, for a male authority figure to protect him from the chaos of his environment. Enter Brian Birdman Williams. Beyond seeing a talented kid who could rap, Birdman recognized a psychological vulnerability ripe for molding. He saw a void and deliberately stepped into it. Birdman did not merely sign Lil Wayne to a contract. He initiated a profound process of psychological grooming. He insisted that Wayne call him Pa. He brought the young teenager into his orbit, providing him with money, protection, and a highly conditional form of paternal love. To a fatherless child who had just watched his stepfather get lowered into the ground, Birdman appeared as a savior rather than a mere record executive. This dynamic is crucial. The corporate music industry is fundamentally an extraction industry, and the most efficient way to extract value from a human being is to ensure their absolute, unquestioning loyalty. By intertwining business with the sacred concept of family, Birdman ensured that Wayne would view any attack on the label not as a business dispute, but as an attack on his own father. In 1997, the Williams brothers made a strategic decision that would alter the trajectory of hip-hop. They paired their foundational anchor, BG, with their young prodigy, Lil Wayne, alongside Juvenile and Turk, to form the supergroup, the Hot Boys. It was a masterclass in street-level synergy. BG provided the hardened, impenetrable credibility that grounded the group in terrifying reality. Wayne provided the frantic, youthful dexterity that captivated the younger audience. Juvenile brought the undeniable hit-making bounce. Together, they were a monolithic force. They shared cramped hotel rooms, wore matching oversized chains, and projected an image of absolute, uncompromising brotherhood. For the young men in the group, the Cash Money Millionaires moniker transcended a marketing slogan to become a blood oath. They believed they had conquered the systemic poverty of New Orleans together. They believed they were a family. They were catastrophically naive about the nature of the table they were sitting at. By 1998, the independent dominance of Cash Money Records had grown too loud for the corporate conglomerates to ignore. The major labels in New York and Los Angeles, constantly tracking demographic trends, recognized a massive, untapped goldmine in Southern hip-hop. Universal Music Group swooped in, placing a historic $30 million distribution deal on the table. To the untrained eye, and certainly to the young men from the projects, it looked like total victory. It was framed as the ultimate Cinderella story. Local boys make good, secure generational wealth and retain ownership of their master recordings. The television screens were suddenly flooded with images of the Hot Boys dripping in flawless diamonds, purchasing fleets of exotic vehicles and flying on private jets. But the boardroom does not hand out $30 million out of charity, and it certainly does not view working-class artists as equal partners. The corporate machine operates on a strict hierarchy of capital. The millions of dollars flowing from Universal into Cash Money did not magically trickle down equitably to the artists whose voices were actually generating the revenue. Birdman and Slim controlled the accounting. They controlled the ledgers. And more importantly, they controlled the narrative. The executives understood a cynical truth about young men who have survived extreme poverty. If you want to keep them compliant, you do not hand them financial literacy or equity. You hand them cash. You buy them cars. You cover them in jewelry. You provide them with the aesthetic of wealth while quietly retaining the actual structural power of the capital. As the late 1990s drew to a close, the trap was meticulously set. The hot boys were the hottest commodity in the American music industry, moving millions of units and generating staggering profits for Universal. But beneath the surface of the bling era, a term coined by BG himself that became so culturally dominant, it entered the dictionary. A silent financial rot was taking hold. BG, the man who had built the label from the dirt, was looking around at the private jets and the platinum plaques, and he was beginning to ask a very dangerous question. He was looking at the ledgers, doing the crude mathematics of his own record sales, and realizing that the numbers did not add up. The brotherhood was an illusion. The paternal love was a management tactic, and the $30 million dream was about to turn into a psychological nightmare. The awakening was imminent, and the corporate machine was quietly preparing to defend its vault. The year 1999 was a watershed moment for the American music economy. It was the year Southern hip-hop stopped being a regional novelty and became an industrial superpower. At the absolute epicenter of this cultural shift was Christopher B.G. Dorsey. He released his album Chopper City in the Ghetto, a raw, uncompromising project that achieved platinum status almost overnight. But the true financial engine of that album was a single track, a cultural phenomenon that fundamentally altered the English lexicon. Bling Bling. The sheer scale of the ensuing exploitation was directly tied to the economic footprint of that single phrase. Bling Bling was not just a hit record, it was a macroeconomic driver. It became the defining anthem of the late 90s era of excess. The term was eventually added to the Oxford English Dictionary. It sold millions of records, generated massive syndication revenue, and drove the valuation of Cash Money Records into the stratosphere. Universal Music Group, the corporate parent, was reaping the rewards of a global cultural movement authored by a teenager from the Magnolia Projects. Yet, the microeconomic reality for BG was a terrifying paradox. He was the architect of a multi-million-dollar aesthetic, but his own financial foundation was built on quicksand. The mechanism of this exploitation relied on a profound understanding of working-class poverty. When a young man spends his entire life in an environment defined by extreme scarcity, his brain becomes wired for immediate survival and immediate validation. The executives at Cash Money and Universal understood this psychological vulnerability perfectly. They knew that if you sat a teenager from the projects down with a team of corporate lawyers and offered him a long-term equity split, publishing rights, and ownership of his master recordings, the concepts would feel abstract, distant, and useless in the immediate reality of his neighborhood. But if you opened the trunk of a car and handed that same teenager a duffel bag stuffed with $50,000 in cash, a diamond-encrusted pendant, and the keys to a brand new Mercedes-Benz, you purchased his absolute loyalty. This was the trap of the bling-bling era. Birdman and the label executives operated on a system of aggressive, highly visible paternalism. They did not provide BG with transparent accounting. They did not show him the ledgers detailing how much Universal had paid for his distribution rights. They simply bought him expensive toys. They created an environment where asking for a royalty statement was positioned as a sign of disrespect, a violation of the family code. The message was clear. I took you out of the projects, I put diamonds on your neck, and you dare question my accounting? But BG was not a fool. The street code he was raised on is ultimately based on a brutal, mathematical pragmatism. You count the product and you count the return. As the year 2000 approached, BG began to look past the diamonds and the luxury vehicles. He saw the sold-out arenas across the country. He saw the platinum plaques lining the walls of the corporate offices. And then he looked at his own bank accounts. The numbers simply did not align. The duffel bags of cash were a smokescreen, designed to distract him from the millions of dollars in publishing and mechanical royalties that were being quietly siphoned off by the corporate tier. When BG initiated the confrontation, asking the dangerous questions about his contracts and his compensation, the label did not respond with transparency. They responded with a calculated, ruthless smear campaign. To execute this smear campaign, the corporate machine weaponized the darkest, most painful aspect of BG's life, his severe addiction to heroin. The music industry has a long documented history of romanticizing substance abuse when it sells records, only to weaponize that same abuse against the artist when they become a financial liability. BG's highly visible addiction was a direct, tragic consequence of untreated PTSD. He was a young man who had watched his father be murdered, who had survived shootouts in one of the deadliest cities in America, and who was suddenly thrust into the blinding, high-pressure machinery of global fame. Without access to therapy or mental health infrastructure, he self-medicated with the most powerful anesthetic available on the streets of New Orleans. A benevolent manager, a true father figure, would have halted the touring schedule. They would have intervened, secured professional medical help, and prioritized the survival of the human being over the delivery of the next album. Operating under extreme pressure from Universal to deliver quarterly earnings, Cash Money Records functioned strictly as a ruthless business, abandoning the facade of family. They kept BG in the recording booth and on the road, enabling his addiction as long as he was productive. However, the moment BG demanded his rightful millions, his addiction was suddenly transformed into a corporate defense strategy. The narrative was quietly, efficiently leaked to the industry and the streets. When people asked why the foundational star of Cash Money was complaining about money, the label's surrogates pushed a simple, devastating lie. BG isn't being robbed. He's a junkie. He smoked and shot his entire fortune away. This is the ultimate cruelty of the boardroom. They stripped him of both his rightful earnings and his hard-earned credibility. They gaslit a traumatized artist, using his very real illness to invalidate his perfectly legitimate legal grievances. They painted him as an erratic, unreliable addict who could not be trusted with his own finances, thereby justifying their total control over his revenue streams. The psychological violence of this tactic is profound. BG found himself screaming the truth into a void, completely neutralized by a narrative engineered by the men who were actively exploiting him. Faced with a system that refused to pay him and a surrogate family that was actively destroying his reputation, BG made a terrifying, courageous choice. In 2001, he walked away. He severed his ties with Cash Money Records. He left the protection of the Universal Distribution Network. He walked away from the guaranteed marketing budgets, the fleet of luxury cars, and the massive manufactured aura of the Hot Boys. He chose his dignity over his subjugation. He stepped out into the brutal reality of the independent circuit, determined to rebuild his empire from the ground up, entirely on his own terms. Shortly after, Juvenile, the other massive commercial anchor of the group, followed suit, leaving the label over similar financial disputes. Inside the executive suites of Cash Money Records, panic set in. The facade of the impenetrable family was shattering. The label had just lost the two primary artists responsible for securing the $30 million Universal contract. The infrastructure was bleeding out, and Birdman realized that his entire empire was on the verge of total collapse. He had only one major asset left, one final firewall between his corporate lifestyle and total financial ruin. He had to secure Lil Wayne. The psychological lockdown of Dwayne Carter Jr. that followed is one of the most intense examples of corporate grooming in modern entertainment. Birdman knew that Wayne was highly intelligent. If Wayne was left alone to process the departure of his older brothers, he would eventually start asking the exact same questions BG and Juvenile had asked. Birdman had to preemptively sever Wayne's loyalty to his former group mates and anchor it entirely to the executive suite. To achieve this, the label initiated a massive, overwhelming wave of financial and emotional intoxication. Birdman recognized Wayne's deep, unresolved trauma regarding his murdered father figures. He aggressively amplified the Pa narrative. He convinced Wayne that BG and Juvenile had not left because of predatory contracts. He convinced Wayne they had left because they were disloyal, jealous, and ungrateful. He framed their departure as a personal attack on the family. Simultaneously, the corporate vault was thrown wide open, but only for Wayne. The label bestowed upon the 19-year-old artist the title of President of Cash Money Records. It was a hollow, largely ceremonial title with no actual equity, but it carried immense psychological weight. It made Wayne feel like an executive, elevating him above the status of a mere artist. They bought him the cars that BG had left behind. They moved him into sprawling mansions. They entirely insulated him within a bubble of sycophants and yes-men who constantly reinforced his ego and his dependence on Birdman. The system understood that Wayne was young enough to be molded into the perfect corporate weapon. By giving him the illusion of ultimate power, they successfully blinded him to his actual powerlessness. Wayne looked around at his new cars, his new title, and the undivided attention of the label, and he genuinely believed he was winning. He believed that his loyalty was being rewarded. He did not realize that he was simply being fattened up to carry the entire weight of the Universal contract on his own shoulders. With BG exiled and Wayne successfully isolated and intoxicated by his new status, the corporate machine prepared for its next ruthless phase. It was not enough to simply keep Wayne at the label. To completely neutralize the threat posed by BG's defection, the system needed to destroy BG's remaining street credibility. And the executives knew that the most devastating way to destroy a street legend is to have his own brother pull the trigger. The boardroom was about to send Lil Wayne into the recording booth, transforming a traumatized prodigy from Holly Grove into a corporate attack dog. The transition from corporate strategy to public execution is the most insidious phase of boardroom warfare. By late 2001, Birdman and the Cash Money Brass had successfully isolated Lil Wayne within a gilded cage, operating with the quiet, structural backing of their corporate partners at Universal. They had granted him the hollow title of president, flooded his driveway with luxury vehicles, and heavily reinforced the narrative that his former brothers were jealous traitors. But maintaining Lil Wayne's loyalty was only half of the corporate mandate. To fully protect the multi-million-dollar Cash Money empire, the system had to utterly destroy the credibility of the men who had walked away. BG and Juvenile had to be made examples of. Birdman and his inner circle understood that if BG succeeded on the independent circuit, he would create a terrifying precedent. He would prove to other artists that survival outside the exploitative major label system was possible. The rebellion had to be crushed, and the system demanded that Lil Wayne be the one to swing the hammer. This is where the standard narrative of hip-hop rivalries entirely breaks down. When the public consumes a rap feud, they see two artists willingly engaging in a battle of lyrical supremacy and street ego. Far from a natural collision of street egos, this was a mandated corporate hit. Lil Wayne was sent into the recording booth to protect the profit margins of the very label that was systematically robbing him, rather than defending his own honor. The resulting music from this era, specifically Wayne's 2002 album 500 Degrees, a title cynically designed to disrespect Juvenile's landmark 400 Degrees, was laced with venom directed at his former family. Wayne launched a barrage of subliminal and explicit lyrical attacks aimed squarely at BG. He mocked BG's independent status. He publicly questioned his street credibility. Most devastatingly, he parroted the exact corporate talking points that Birdman had engineered, weaponizing BG's struggle with addiction to paint him as an unreliable, bitter failure who had thrown away his shot at greatness. To a casual listener, Wayne was just establishing his dominance as a solo artist. But to analyze the psychological architecture of these attacks is to look into the abyss of corporate grooming. Wayne was a young man in his late teens, heavily traumatized by the loss of his biological and stepfathers, now desperately clinging to the only paternal figure he had left. Birdman had convinced him that attacking his brothers was the ultimate proof of his loyalty to the family. Wayne was effectively brainwashed, suffering from a highly lucrative form of Stockholm Syndrome. He was fighting viciously to defend the honor of the very executives who held the leash around his neck. For BG, the psychological devastation of hearing these records is difficult to quantify. To be robbed of millions of dollars by a corporate entity is a brutal economic reality, but it is a familiar one for young black men in America. To have your reputation assassinated by a rival gang is a recognized risk of the streets. But to be publicly humiliated and degraded by the younger brother you helped raise, a kid you had protected in the projects, shared hotel rooms with, and mentored in the recording booth, is a betrayal that permanently fractures a man's spirit. BG was a strict adherent to the street code. In his world, loyalty was absolute. You did not speak against your brother, and you certainly did not side with the boss who was stealing from him. Hearing Wayne's attacks, BG realized with crushing clarity that the Brotherhood had been completely eradicated by the boardroom. This was no ordinary rap beef. BG was watching a hostage read a ransom note written by his captors. BG attempted to fight back. He launched his own independent label, Chopper City Records, and released a series of raw, aggressive underground albums. He went to the studio and recorded tracks explicitly detailing Birdman's exploitative contracts, the stolen royalties, and the predatory nature of Cash Money Records. He tried to warn Wayne, he tried to shout the truth to the masses, but BG was bringing a knife to a drone strike. He was fighting a localized, independent war against a global corporate monopoly. This is the hidden, terrifying mechanics of a corporate blacklist. When an artist leaves a major label like Universal on bad terms, the retaliation often manifests as a quiet, invisible strangulation rather than a loud public lawsuit. Universal Music Group and Cash Money Records held the keys to the entire mainstream kingdom. They controlled the massive distribution networks. They possessed the leverage to dictate terms to national radio programmers. They held the budgets that funded the top-tier producers and video directors. The unspoken rule in the music industry was immediately established. You do not do business with BG if you want to remain in the good graces of Universal and Cash Money. The economic blockade tightened around BG with ruthless efficiency. The major feature verses from other mainstream artists abruptly dried up as managers refused to clear their clients to work with a man who was an enemy of Birdman. The elite producers in the industry suddenly stopped returning BG's calls, terrified that selling him a beat would result in their own blacklisting from lucrative Cash Money projects. National radio stations, heavily influenced by the promotional dollars of major labels, refused to put BG's independent singles into rotation. He was systematically starved of the essential infrastructure required to compete on a national level. The executives in Manhattan and Los Angeles did not have to threaten anyone physically. They simply used their massive market share to build an invisible wall around BG. They cut off his oxygen supply and waited for him to suffocate. The contrast between the two former brothers during this period between 2002 and 2004 was a masterclass in capitalist disparity. Lil Wayne was being groomed for absolute global superstardom. He was placed on the heaviest MTV rotations, given multi-million-dollar video budgets, and insulated by a massive corporate security apparatus. He was traveling the world on private jets, hailed as the future of hip-hop, entirely shielded from the grim reality of the streets that had birthed him. BG, conversely, was pushed back to the raw, dangerous, and unforgiving grind of the regional independent circuit. To feed his family and keep his fledgling label afloat, he was forced to perform in small, highly volatile clubs across the Deep South. He was traveling in vans, hustling to secure his own distribution, and operating without the physical or financial protection of a corporate entity. The system had engineered a flawless, brutal zero-sum game. They had elevated the compliant asset to the status of a deity and banished the rebellious asset to the wilderness. But the wilderness is a profoundly dangerous place for a man carrying severe, untreated trauma and a heavy public target on his back. By forcing BG out of the corporate safety net and economically starving him, the executives knew exactly what they were doing. They were pushing him back into the proximity of the illicit street economy. They knew that extreme financial stress, combined with the profound emotional agony of his betrayal and his ongoing battle with addiction, would create a highly volatile cocktail. A man stripped of his legitimate earning potential by a corporate monopoly cannot simply sit quietly and wait for justice. He has to survive. He has to maintain his infrastructure. And when the boardrooms lock their doors, the streets are always willing to offer a terrible alternative loan. While the Universal executives watched the trajectory of their former star with cold, administrative detachment, Birdman had successfully weaponized Lil Wayne to destroy the solidarity of the Hot Boys. They had protected the $30 million Universal contract. They had established absolute, uncontested dominance over the Southern hip-hop market. BG was struggling to keep his head above water, and Lil Wayne was locked safely inside the vault, generating unprecedented wealth for his corporate father. To the men counting the dividends, the operation was a flawless success, but the bill for this level of psychological and economic violence inevitably comes due. The corporate machine had successfully engineered a trap, but they were entirely unprepared for the devastating real-world casualties that their mathematics were about to produce. The boardroom had lit the fuse, and the explosion was destined to completely destroy the lives of the young men they had pitted against each other. The destruction of a human being by a corporate entity is rarely a swift execution. It is usually a slow, agonizing process of attrition. As the mid-2000s progressed, Christopher B.G. Dorsey found himself caught in a brutal war of attrition against an invisible, omnipresent enemy. He was no longer fighting for platinum plaques or chart dominance. He was fighting for his physical and psychological survival. He had been successfully amputated from the cash money empire, blacklisted by the Universal Music Group distribution networks, and subjected to a relentless, industry-wide smear campaign led by his own former brother, Lil Wayne. But in 2005, the corporate strangulation of BG's career collided with an unprecedented natural catastrophe that would entirely eradicate his remaining safety net. Hurricane Katrina struck the Gulf Coast, violently drowning the city of New Orleans. The storm did not just destroy infrastructure, it decimated the highly localized working-class economy that independent artists like BG relied upon to survive. The uptown neighborhoods, including the Magnolia projects that had shaped his identity, were effectively wiped off the map. His core fan base, the people who had sustained his independent label, Chopper City Records, through the corporate blockade, were displaced, scattered across the country in a massive, traumatizing diaspora. The sheer cruelty of BG's situation during this era was heavily magnified by this extreme geographic and cultural displacement. While executives in New York and Los Angeles were safely insulated from the tragedy, tracking their fourth quarter earnings, BG lost his physical foundation. A man who had already been robbed of his corporate family was now robbed of his geographic home. The psychological toll of this compounding trauma was devastating. BG was a man carrying the heavy, untreated wounds of a murdered father, the profound betrayal of his surrogate family, the ongoing battle with severe heroin addiction, and now the total destruction of his city. Without the multi-million-dollar security apparatus that major labels provide to their elite artists, BG was forced to navigate the chaotic, highly dangerous post-Katrina underworld entirely unprotected. When a man is systematically starved of his legitimate earning potential and stripped of his physical security, the street code demands that he protect himself. In the destabilized environment of post-storm Louisiana, where the police infrastructure was fundamentally broken and violent crime was surging, walking completely unarmed was an invitation to be victimized. BG was a high-profile, recognizable figure with a known history of wealth, operating in desperate, poverty-stricken environments. He could not afford private security teams. He had to rely on the brutal, unforgiving laws of the pavement. This is the terrifying, unspoken symbiosis between the corporate music industry and the American criminal justice system. The executives sitting in the glass boardrooms understand a grim sociological truth. If you financially blockade a traumatized, marginalized man, you do not have to spend corporate funds to destroy him. You simply wait. You wait for the stress of poverty to force him back into the illicit economy. You wait for the lack of corporate security to force him to carry a weapon for his own protection. And then you let the police handle the rest. It is a self-cleaning mechanism for disposing of unwanted human assets. The trap that had been set years earlier finally snapped shut on November 3rd, 2009. BG was pulled over by the police during a routine traffic stop in East New Orleans. When officers searched the vehicle, they discovered 3 firearms and several loaded magazines. For a young man from the suburbs, this might have resulted in a manageable legal headache. But for Christopher Dorsey, a man with a prior felony record, it was a catastrophic event. He was immediately thrust into the aggressive, unyielding machinery of the federal justice system. The courtroom proceedings laid bare the sickening disparity of the corporate zero-sum game. While BG was facing severe federal gun charges, fighting for his life against prosecutors who viewed him as nothing more than a violent statistic, Lil Wayne was operating in an entirely different universe. By the late 2000s, Lil Wayne had been successfully molded into the ultimate corporate deity. His album, Thaw Carter III, had sold a staggering 1 million copies in its first week. He was performing in sold-out arenas in London, Paris, and Tokyo. He was draped in flawless diamonds, protected by armies of lawyers and former military security personnel, and generating hundreds of millions of dollars for Universal Music Group. Wayne had perfectly executed the mandate handed down by Birdman. He had absorbed the legacy of the Hot Boys, silenced the dissenters, and become the undisputed king of the industry. But the juxtaposition of these two lives is not a testament to Wayne's superior character or BG's inherent criminality. It is a stark, terrifying display of how the system allocates resources. Lil Wayne was allowed to thrive because he was compliant. He surrendered his autonomy to the executives, and in return, they shielded him from the consequences of the streets. BG demanded accountability, challenged the accounting ledgers, and refused to be a compliant asset. His punishment was the total withdrawal of that corporate shield, leaving him completely exposed to the predatory mechanics of the justice system. On July 18, 2012, the final act of this specific tragedy was codified in a federal courtroom. The judge did not see a foundational music pioneer who had been financially exploited and traumatized by a multi-billion-dollar industry. The judge saw a repeat offender, Christopher B.G. Dorsey, was sentenced to 14 years in federal prison. The sentence was an absolute death blow. A 14-year sentence goes far beyond a mere penalty. It guarantees the complete eradication of a man's prime earning years. It is the forced separation from his children. It is the violent silencing of an authentic, uncompromising voice. When the heavy iron doors of the federal penitentiary closed behind B.G., the corporate executives finally achieved their ultimate victory. The man who possessed the institutional memory of their early exploitative contracts, the man who had dared to demand transparency, and the man who threatened to expose the illusion of their family was now effectively buried alive by the state. They did not have to pay him a settlement. They did not have to negotiate his royalties. The government had permanently neutralized their problem, entirely free of charge. But the tragedy of a zero-sum game engineered by capitalists is that the winner on the board is rarely the one holding the pieces. Lil Wayne had won the rap feud. He had secured the crown. He had maintained his absolute loyalty to his surrogate father, Birdman, and he had defended the cash money empire against all challengers. He was the most famous and lucrative hip-hop artist on the planet. But as Wayne entered the 2000s, standing alone at the absolute apex of the global music industry, the intoxicating illusion of his gilded cage began to slowly, agonizingly wear off. Wayne was working at a frantic, almost suicidal pace. He was releasing albums, mixtapes, and feature verses with a frequency that defied human endurance. And just like B.G. before him, Wayne was self-medicating heavily to cope with the immense crushing pressure of his existence. He developed a severe addiction to promethazine and codeine syrup, a dependency that would result in multiple highly publicized, life-threatening seizures. The corporate machine did not intervene to save Wayne's health, just as they had not intervened to save B.G. They simply placed a doctor on his private jet, ensured he was medicated enough to perform, and kept the touring schedule booked solid. Stripped of his illusions as an executive or a cherished son, Wayne was reduced to a highly specialized, incredibly expensive workhorse that the label was determined to ride until he collapsed. As Wayne approached his 30s, the fog of his youth and his desperate need for paternal approval finally began to clear. He started to look at the massive global empire he had built. He saw the billions of streams, the sold-out stadium tours, and the massive valuation of the Cash Money brand. And then, for the first time in his adult life, Wayne did exactly what his older brother B.G. had done 15 years prior. He asked to see the ledgers. What Lil Wayne was about to discover would completely shatter his reality and force him into a painful, devastating reckoning. He was about to learn the hardest, most unforgiving lesson of the American music industry. The executives who pay you millions of dollars to betray your brother will, without a moment's hesitation, eventually betray you. The loyalty Wayne had sacrificed his integrity to protect was nothing more than a line item on a balance sheet, and the corporate assassination he had helped facilitate was about to be turned directly against him. When Dwayne Carter Jr. finally demanded transparency from the corporate apparatus he had spent his entire life protecting, the illusion of his surrogate family collapsed with terrifying speed. By 2014, Lil Wayne was universally recognized as one of the most prolific and commercially successful artists in the history of recorded music. He had successfully carried the Cash Money Records banner through a turbulent decade, generating hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue for Brian Birdman Williams and the Universal Music Group. He had sacrificed his childhood, his physical health, and his closest brothers to defend the empire. He firmly believed that his unquestioning compliance had earned him absolute equity and the unconditional love of the man he called Pa. He was about to learn that in the high-stakes arena of corporate capitalism, compliance does not earn you equity, it only earns you a longer leash. The fracture occurred over the highly anticipated release of his album, The Carter Five. Wayne had spent years recording the project, pouring his exhausting, heavily medicated reality into the music. By the terms of any standard, equitable business partnership, the delivery of the album should have triggered a massive multi-million-dollar advance and a coordinated global release strategy. Instead, Birdman simply locked the hard drives in the corporate vault and refused to release the record. The label cited administrative delays and shifting market strategies. But the reality was far more sinister. The corporate executives were executing a classic leverage maneuver. They understood that as long as they controlled Wayne's art, they controlled his capital. They were withholding his primary source of income to force him into signing yet another exploitative contract extension. They were starving the most famous rapper in the world, utilizing the exact same financial asphyxiation tactics they had used against BG a decade earlier. The psychological shock to Lil Wayne was profound. For his entire adult life, he had been completely insulated from the predatory mechanics of his own record deal because he had never dared to challenge it. When he finally pushed back, the benevolent father figure instantly vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating corporate executive. On December 4th, 2014, Lil Wayne shattered the 15-year illusion of the Cash Money family. He bypassed the publicists and the corporate handlers, taking directly to Twitter to issue a desperate, unprecedented cry for help. To all my fans, I want you to know that my album won't and hasn't been released because Baby and Cash Money Records refused to release it, he wrote. I want off this label and nothing to do with these people, but unfortunately, it ain't that easy. I am a prisoner. Read those words carefully. I am a prisoner. Far from a manufactured rap feud to drive album sales, this was the terrifying realization of a man finally waking up inside a gilded cage. Wayne, the artist who had mocked BG for walking away from the label, the prodigy who had blindly trusted his surrogate father, was publicly admitting that his entire reality was a corporate hostage situation. He finally understood that he did not own his master recordings, he did not control his publishing, and he did not even possess the basic legal right to release his own voice to the public. In early 2015, the unthinkable happened. Lil Wayne filed a staggering $51 million lawsuit against Cash Money Records and Brian Williams. The legal filings laid bare a grotesque history of alleged financial manipulation. The lawsuit claimed that Cash Money had systematically failed to pay Wayne his guaranteed advances, withheld massive portions of his royalties, and refused to provide transparent accounting records for the Young Money imprint he had built underneath their umbrella. Wayne was sitting in a sterile law office in Manhattan, paying incredibly expensive litigators to read through the dense, predatory clauses of the exact same contracts that BG had warned him about 15 years prior. The bitter, devastating irony of this moment is the ultimate tragedy of the Hot Boys' Civil War. Lil Wayne realized that he had been weaponized. He had allowed the label to wind him up and point him at his own brothers. He had publicly degraded BG, assassinated the credibility of Juvenile, and fractured the solidarity of his hometown, all to defend the honor of a corporate manager who was quietly stealing from him the entire time. He had burned down his own house to keep a stranger warm. The legal battle that ensued was grueling, humiliating, and emotionally exhausting for Wayne. Birdman and the corporate lawyers at Universal employed the standard attrition strategy, dragging the litigation out for years, knowing that they had the infinite financial runway to bleed Wayne dry in legal fees. Wayne suffered severe emotional distress and escalating health crises during this period. The man who was once the undisputed king of the industry was sidelined, forced to watch his prime earning years slip away in a swamp of injunctions and settlement negotiations, all while his surrogate father continued to pose for the cameras and count the dividends. In 2018, a settlement was finally reached. Universal Music Group reportedly stepped in, cutting a massive check to buy Wayne out of his Cash Money contract and secure the release of Thaw Carter 5. To the public, it was announced as a victory. Wayne was finally free, but analyze the actual outcome of the zero-sum game. Wayne received a settlement, yes, but he had lost his absolute prime. He had lost years of creative output. He had suffered immense physical and psychological damage. And most tragically, he had lost the brotherhood that had birthed him. He had won his freedom, but he was standing completely alone on the battlefield. Meanwhile, what were the consequences for the men who engineered this multi-decade tragedy? Brian Birdman Williams walked away exceptionally wealthy. He did not go to prison for the alleged financial manipulation. He was not exiled from the industry. The Universal Music Group executives who had quietly funded the operation, who had watched the Hot Boys tear each other apart while securing their distribution margins, remained comfortably seated in their high-rise offices, completely insulated from the trauma they had bankrolled, and in a federal penitentiary, hundreds of miles away from the flashbulbs and the settlement announcements, Christopher B.G. Dorsey sat in a concrete cell serving out his 14-year sentence. He had been right from the very beginning. He had seen the trap before anyone else, but because he lacked the corporate protection that Wayne was granted, he was punished with the absolute eradication of his freedom. Ultimately, the tragedy of the Hot Boys transcends a simple cautionary tale of bad contracts. It is a chilling autopsy of an industry that feeds on the trauma of the working class. If BG and Lil Wayne had remained united, they possessed the leverage to demand ownership and rewrite the economic reality of Southern hip-hop. To neutralize that immense power, the executives weaponized Lil Wayne's desperate need for a father figure against BG's uncompromising integrity. It stands as a hard-hitting reminder. When marginalized talents are manipulated into a civil war for a fraction of their worth, the only entity that walks away unscarred is the house. The artists carry the trauma, the artists serve the sentences, and the artists write the diss tracks. The men in the tailored suits never bleed, they only collect.